In the first presentation, Janet Boddy is going to address the theme of family practices in relation to environmental issues, both with reference to qualitative fieldwork, new fieldwork, and quantitative data, both in India and the UK. And after the break, Heather Elliott and I are going to view family life through the prism of life story research, drawing upon two existing, well, we're going to only draw on one data set for this presentation, but in the research we draw on two existing data sets to which we have, in this novella project, applied a narrative lens. This will be followed by Abigail Knight, who is going to address issues that arise when we study family practices, particularly food, when we do field work in the archives. So we have looked there at data that was not collected for the purposes of the research in mind. Next, Rebecca O'Connell and Heather Elliott will successively address two smaller projects that Anne mentioned. They were at the top and the bottom of her diagram, which are highly innovative. The first one uses blog data to study contemporary issues around food and mothers feeding their families. And the other project, called Paradata, was to study marginalia, the jottings that researchers put in the margins of their questionnaires on a major study by Peter Townsend called Poverty in the UK, which was conducted in the 1960s. So that's this morning's programme, and those are the projects that form the core of the Novella research programme. This afternoon, we're turning to issues around collaboration. Molly Andrews will introduce this, and we're going to hear from our two linked doctoral researchers, postgraduate researchers, Catherine and Jo, who are going to talk about reflexivity and collaboration from the point of view of their two very separate doctoral research projects. And after the tea break, we had hoped that Professor Kathy Reisman, who will be known to many of you, would address us. But very unfortunately, she's very unwell today and can't be with us. However, not all is lost. She sent her lecture, and Molly Andrews here is going to stand in and become Kathy for this afternoon, and she will hopefully be able to have a discussion as well around the lecture. Finally, Anne Phoenix, you've heard from, is going to summarise or look back on the day and point us in the direction of the future. And then we will have a panel discussion by some very distinguished members who've kindly agreed to do this. So I think I've covered most things, and now I'm going to hand over to Richard Twine, who's going to chair this morning's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I didn't know I was going to chair quite so quickly for that. Okay. Yeah, it's my pleasure to chair and to begin with paper by Janet Boddy.
Thanks, Richard.
I'm sorry. You're quite right, Richard.
That's fine.
You can both chair me. I probably need it. So it's wonderful to be here today, and it's especially exciting to be the analysis that I'm going to be talking about. It's the first time we presented it, so it's particularly exciting for us to share it with you, and we're really interested to hear your responses to it. As you can see from this slide, I'm talking on behalf of a large team, including colleagues from Novella at IOE, but also colleagues who are part of the Young Lives study in Oxford in India. And we did as I'll come on to say, we did a secondary analysis of some of their very fantastic qualitative data set. So I'll come on to that in a little bit. The overall aim of our study, which was called Family Lives and the Environment, was really to improve understanding of the negotiated complexity of families' lives with regard to the meanings of environment in everyday family lives and family practices. And the prompt for that is really an issue that researchers such as Elizabeth Shove have picked up here about oversimplification in climate change policy in particular. And related to that, another aspect of oversimplification is about the moralisation of environmentalism, or as Ramchandra Guha says here, about unambiguously identifying good and evil amongst individuals and particular ways of life. So we wanted to start as a kind of response to those perspectives to try and capture the complex meanings of environment in everyday family lives and family narratives. And I think you can see something of this moralising discourse in Nathan Bell's comments here. Bell's writing about the idea of an environmental identity. And my aim here isn't to take issue specifically with Bell. I mean, there are other examples that I could have chosen. It's really, I want to make a wider point, which is that to understand the multiple meanings of environment in everyday lives, we need to move away from these kinds of moralising and binarising categorisations that assume some identities are foundational, engaged or unengaged, concerned or apathetic, to attend instead to complexity and to diversity. And that leaves us with a methodological question, really, about how those kinds of deeper understandings can be achieved. And that's something I think that's true for Novella as a whole. It's how you can use innovative methodological approaches to capture complex issues that aren't easily researched. And we were working cross-nationally in India and the UK. Cross-national research is particularly valuable because it has the capacity to question the inevitability of certain ways of understanding. It gives a fresh perspective on shared challenges. By conducting research in these very contrasting contexts, we aim to illuminate the possibilities for learning from difference. So not to compare, but to hold different contexts in conversation with each other to see what we could learn. And I think one way forward in grasping complexity is to recognise the cultural specificity of global north paradigms of environmentalism. Policy arguments about lower consumption until recently have focused primarily on high-income northern countries, although there's increasing concern about rising consumption in global south countries such as India. But the Young Lives data very clearly show that most Indian families have not experienced affluent consumerism. Global north paradigms of sustainability and lower consumption are really of questionable relevance in those contexts where the majority of the population is still at very low levels of consumption. The other issue relating to this is that northern writers sometimes suggest that environmental concern is a full stomach phenomenon. But I want to draw on a comparative analysis by Ramchandra Guha, who's an Indian environmental historian, which suggests a more complex distinction. And Guha's perspective, I think, is also important here because it involves theorising about the global south from the global south. So theorisation on climate change doesn't just then come from a global north perspective. Of course, the distinction that Guha makes here is not an absolute one. There are parallels to these environmental movements in each country. But he makes a really important distinction here, I think, in the extent to which environmental activism is concerned with human society or with the non-human other. And Guha also highlights the question of immediacy. So for dominant environmental movements in India, what's at risk isn't an abstract notion of the good life or the good world. What's at risk is everyday life itself. And to understand everyday lives and families, we also need to recognise the fundamental interconnectedness of family relationships. So, as David Morgan says here, we're not simply individual practitioners. Practices and the meanings of practices are relational, dynamic, negotiated and maintained within wider social structures as well as within everyday family lives. And a narrative analytic approach, because of the focus on meaning making, provides a valuable way into understanding the meanings of families' everyday practices and their relationship to individual and collective identities within families. Narrative approaches are also useful because practices are also connected, not just socially, but within time and space. And one of the things that a narrative analytic approach does, by analysing sequencing and progression, is to illuminate the social, the spatial, and the temporal nature of family practices. And I think particularly relevant for understanding families in relation to environment, the ways in which stories are told within interviews can also provide insights into what Jerome Bruner terms canonical narratives, reflecting participants' understandings of and their response to socially and culturally accepted norms. So narratives are a very useful framework for drawing these concerns together. In highlighting the fact that we're not merely individual practitioners, we also highlight questions about our wider interconnectedness. And one of the conceptual resources for our analysis is Judith Butler's concept of the precarious life. Now, it's important to note this isn't the same as precarity as a class construct, as in Guy Standing's analysis. Rather, Butler's argument is predicated on recognising the inevitable interdependency of all of our lives. She developed this theorisation in the aftermath of 9/11. She wasn't writing about environment or about climate change, but we feel that her construct provides a very useful conceptual framework for considering interdependency in the context of climate change. Precarious life involves dependence on those we do not know, as well as those that we do. We affect the environment by our practices of consumption, and in doing so, we affect other lives and are affected by the practices of others. But precarity is also politically and economically produced. Some lives are more precarious than others, and structural inequalities can also be seen in the ways in which some lives and not others are framed as recognisable, as entitled to protection. And we need to recognise both inequality and interconnectedness to recognise what Butler terms an ethical obligation to the other. Applied to the context of climate change, Butler's analysis suggests that we need a more concrete and peopled understanding of environment, rooted in subjective understandings of quotidian lives. And that kind of concretising understanding, I think, is especially helpful because environment is such a broad concept with multiple potential meanings in everyday lives. So what did we do? I think the very nature of the everyday, the fact that it can be seen as trivial or mundane, easily forgotten, that's what makes it difficult to research, as Anne said. We used a multi-method approach, working first with secondary analysis of data from Young Lives qualitative research in Andhra Pradesh in India, and subsequently conducting new data collection with 12 families in Andhra Pradesh and 12 in the UK. I'll talk in particular about the new data collection today, but it was really important for the study that those two phases of work were very strongly connected. The approach met methodological and substantive aims. we explored the possibility of applying narrative approaches in secondary qualitative analysis of the Young Lives data that weren't collected for the purposes of narrative research. And we were working with a sample of just 8 Young Lives families out of a total Young Lives cohort of 12,000. So to just focus on 8 raises really interesting questions in itself. And that analysis also allowed us to develop methodology for our new data collection. And again, that was important because it allowed us as UK researchers to begin by learning from work conducted in India before applying that learning in a UK context. So turning the global north to global south around in a different way. And we combined individual and family group interviews with other data collection methods over 3 visits with each family, capturing meaning making and exploring connections and disconnections, as Anne said, between what people do and what they say they do. And as you can see here, I won't go through this in detail. These are our 24 cases. We deliberately built contrasts into the research design, working in urban and rural areas in each country, and establishing a sample with differing levels of relative affluence. We recruited a volunteer sample through schools in India, and insofar as possible through schools in the UK, although we had very interesting difficulty in sampling through schools in London. So we ended up having to use snowball sampling to complete the London sample. The different schooling structures in the 2 countries meant it wasn't possible to get the same kind of structuring of relative affluence in each country. But we targeted schools in geographical areas in the UK which differed in levels of affluence. And the UK sample does capture the variation that we were after. So in both countries, the sample includes low, middle and high income families. It's of course very important, if very obvious, to note that the levels of relative affluence across the 2 countries and relative poverty across the 2 countries are very different. We weren't seeking comparability across countries, but rather within each country we wanted to capture variation to illuminate the diversity of family lives in each country. And in the remainder of the paper, what I want to do is to consider diverse meanings of environment in ways that bring together, drawing examples that bring together Guha's point about the immediacy of environmental concerns or considerations in everyday life, and Butler's conceptualization of precarity in relation to the environment specifically for our analysis. And the examples that I'll show you are not selecting family cases, although I'm drawing on family cases, but particularly selecting small narratives which speak to these concepts. Because it's important to understand that different narratives are produced at different points in families' accounts. So, in this example here, what you see is the political and economic production of precarity in the family's everyday lived environment. Mamatha's family live in an area of the city which doesn't have legal status, which is in effect an illegal slum. And what she's talking about here is the fact that their previous home, this is Syamala, the mother in the family, their previous home was demolished in a slum clearance. And so while they're now living on the same physical site, they haven't invested again in building a secure home, a secure building, because of the likelihood that their home will be demolished again. And you can see the tension and uncertainty of that in her narrative. And I think this example of environmental insecurity is especially striking because in India, slum clearance for residential or industrial development has often been justified on environmental grounds. I think what you can also see in this case is how the politically and economically produced precariousness of their lives is to some extent mitigated through social relationships, through the interdependence that Butler describes. To show you a very different example now, from Rosie's family, a relatively affluent UK family. And Sally, her mother, is talking about a landowner who's planning a major industrial development close to the village where they live. Now, her story is obviously very different from Syamala's. Her home's not at risk of being demolished, but there are points of connection. Both of these families had migrated, Syamala's family to the city, Sally's family to the countryside. For both, the move was linked in family narratives to imagined futures, to aspirations for a good life for the family. Imagined futures which are rendered uncertain by powerful others, through economic agendas for urban or industrial development. Unlike Syamala, economic security gives Sally some power. She's been involved in protests, and she talks later in the interview about how she can stand up to the landowner because she's not in the precarious position of the tenanted farmers. In addition, and you can see this over the whole family case, that mosaic of data collected with Sally's family, the effects on everyday family practices are confined to practices of activism and protest, including family talk. The effects on Syamala's family are much more deeply felt in their everyday life. And another example here which shows how precarity in everyday life can be environmentally produced. We're vulnerable to environmental dangers, whether that's dangerous animals, which came up a lot in the Indian fieldwork, or climatic events such as drought or flooding, which appeared in both countries. Environmental impacts disproportionately affect poorer families. Again, that's something the Young Lives data demonstrate very clearly. So environmental and economic risk interact, and you can see this in this short extract from a rural Indian family, where the whole family is engaged in the traditional work of thread making for saris. 6 years previously, the local lake overflowed and flooded the local community, including the family home. This extract is from midway through a longish account of what happened. And as you can see, the upshot was that the family were forced to sell their house to replace the tools that they needed for their traditional work of thread making. And as a result of that, they're living with much more insecurity than previously. So I think for all three mothers, for Syamala, for Sally and Sumati, we see the immediacy of environmental concerns for the everyday lived experience of the family. And that immediacy is both temporal and spatial. Their narratives describe impacts on the proximal environment, on family practices within the spaces and places of everyday life, but they also have temporal immediacy in their effects on present and imagined future lives for all of these families. But not all of our families were experiencing precarity in immediate environments. So what did environment mean to them? For the families in our sample who were most consciously pro-environmental in their narratives of family identity and family practices, abstract or spatially distant environmental considerations were often made proximal, woven into accounts of everyday life. And in this, another relatively affluent UK family, the parents worked together to tell the story of how they bring global environmental concern into everyday family life. And this is a recurrent theme in their talk, global environmental concern in everyday lives and practices. And it's used to position a moral identity. So you see Roger say, if everyone took the same responsible position that we're taking. And Julia frames this as a family identity when Humphrey, the child, joins in the conversation. She says, you know that, partly because we keep telling you. And you can see another example in this interview about an affluent urban family in India. Aruna, the mother, tells a small story about how her children make the distal proximate, drawing an emblem of climate change into the practice of using air conditioning. In telling this story, though, she maintains her position by making light of the children's power. She frames the story as a joke and punctuates it with laughter. Now, neither Humphrey nor Amrutha's families are living with immediate environmental insecurity, but throughout their interviews, both sets of parents display their environmental knowledge and their responsibility as a key feature of family identity and family practices. Children are positioned differently in the two narratives, but neither straightforwardly have the power to change family practices. And for Amrutha's family in particular, there's a recurrent narrative of concern from both parents that the children should understand their privileged position. And as you see here from Amrutha's responses, this is a concern that the children consistently challenge. This sense of a responsible or a concerned environmental identity was not universal in our study in either country, and I wanted to end with an example of that. This is an extract from a family group interview with another UK urban family, this time a family of 6, living in council housing in a socially deprived area. And I think what's really important for me is that you can see here that Jordan is not ignorant or apathetic or antagonistic to bigger environmental issues. Elsewhere in the interviews, she and her children discuss temporally and spatially proximate environmental concerns, such as local authority spending priorities, problems with buses. But everyday life, in her words, overpowers everything else. Her narrative drives home the scale of the task. It's everything. That's what we have to deal with. She ends the narrative summing up. She does not construct her family's environment as precarious, but in the context of her life, as for others in our sample, and not only the poorer families, there was little space to draw abstract concern for the environment into everyday family practices. So to conclude, I think it's essential that we understand and we respect perspectives such as Jordan's, people who don't fit our dominant paradigms of environmental concern or environmental activism. As Guha says, we need to recognise the many shades of environmentalism and to understand how they do or do not relate to everyday family lives. One danger of moralising policy discourses is that perspectives such as Jordan's become unspeakable and remain unheard against a dominant canonical narrative of environmental concern. I haven't talked much about methodology today, and I've drawn mostly on interview data. So in closing, I want to emphasise that I think our methodological approach has been crucial to the understanding that we've generated. Using multiple methods that involve family members individually and collectively, and analysing narratives, we've been able to capture those complex and diverse meanings of environment, not as it relates to an abstract notion of the good life, but as it's situated in everyday family lives and practices, and in social and cultural contexts. Guha proposes a social ecology which addresses diversity and equity alongside sustainability. And I think to achieve that multifaceted understanding requires a multi-method approach. I think what we also see is how by studying across contexts within and across countries, we can identify points of connection between very different lives, capturing Judith Butler's notion of recognisable lives, whilst remaining sensitive to difference. And really importantly, what that does is to begin to break down binaries between majority and minority worlds, and break down directions of learning between those very different contexts. Thank you.
hear about it. The question I've got, I get what you're arguing in terms of stepping away from a moralistic construction that would see the middle class families as more as kind of occupying the moral high ground. But I just thought there's also the missing kind of account, which is if you've thought about what is the carbon footprint of those two families, or the four families, or if you're thinking, it's the middle class families who have this gigantic carbon footprint, and the poor families who will have far less, probably. I mean, that's also an interesting question. So it's not simply that these are occupying the moral high ground, they're kind of deflecting or misrepresenting the kind of so I mean what's really interesting is that the kind of narrative about growth has been one where it's seen to be the growth of the poor that's creating environmental disaster, as opposed to it is the kind of practices of the affluent that create that. So I suppose in one way, be careful of critiquing the moral discourse, because actually there's another moral discourse which is being obscured by a particular moral discourse about, environmental identity, because there's a sort of factual, a real sort of thing going on, where actually those middle class families have got huge carbon footprint, whereas the poor families don't.
It's a really interesting point. I think what it also speaks to is something called the Kuznets curve, which is an economic paradigm, which theorizes that environmental impacts actually go down once you reach a certain level of development. So it very straightforwardly allows that development is good because you will go up and then you'll come back down again. And I think that point about how carbon use and carbon footprint then fits into that, I think what this shows is, first of all, that the environmental concerns of the families who are facing precarity are no less important than those of the people who can afford an expensive reco-fit of their house and therefore manage their high consumption in that way. So actually turning around how we think about what environmentalism is about and allowing it to be about people and human concerns, I think that's...
I suppose it's thinking the other way of thinking the environmental burden of that family is also a lot less than the environmental burden,
yes,
the responsibility.
Exactly.
And that's what gets made invisible. Is that in fact they are the ones who are actually having a real.
But I think that's what's interesting about this idea of the kind of responsibility of privilege, that environmentalism allows you to be a high consumer because you do it in environmentally responsible ways. So there's a kind of, and then environmentalism almost becomes something that's philanthropic rather than something that's about a shared concern, and that's something that you see elsewhere actually in Amruza's account, that environmentalism is something that's done for the other rather than because the family themselves see themselves as at risk.
Okay, I think we need to take a break now. Okay, so